Good evening, everyone. I'm really getting used to having somebody do all the talking before me. That's great. Even though I'm a minister and I do a lot of talking, it's nice to hear other people talk as well. So welcome to our midweek service. I will start with a silent meditation. So if you could please sit up straight in your seat with your feet flat on the floor and relax your shoulders. Please join me in Gasho. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namadats, namadats, namadats. So if everybody could please join me in chanting the Jusei Ge, which you have a PDF for in the file that thank you that Michael downloaded, or if you're using the Red Hawaiian Service Book, it is on page 55. Gagon Josei Gan Ishimujodo Shigan Fumanzok Sefu Joshogak Gao Muryoko Fui Dai Seishu Fusai Shobingu Sefu Joshogak Gashi Jobundo Myosho Chojipo Kukyo Mishomon 政府上昇学、利欲人少年、上映主本業、シグ無浄土、一生天人師、人力現代公、不詳無才道、少女三苦名、交際集約難、回避知恵言、滅死根門案、永息小悪道、通達全宗門、高僧上満足、いよろじぽ、日月主樹期、天候温不減、一種解放像、公正功徳法、上大衆住、説法四宿、供養一切物、具足修徳本、元年秩序満、得意三害を、如仏無下知、通達未不詳、願学へ力、投資最小損、志願若国大戦を感動、国小天人、東内妙見、ナマナム、ナマナム、ナマナム、ナマナム、ナマナム、ナマナム、願にしく読、平等正祭、同発菩提心、往生あなお。Namdats, namdats, 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 namdats. If I could ask you to please leave your PDF open or where you were chanting in the book, there's something that I'd like to share that is not related to our class today or my Dharma talk, but I'd like to explain, because sometimes people get confused why in different temples or different ministers chant differently or have a different nuance. And I've been talking to Eric Ishii about that, our Tokudo minister assistant at Ekoji. And it was surprising for me because the way that we chanted at the very end, where it goes down in tone. If you look in the Hawaii book, it's all written straight across. There's no notations to go down or the melody that I have been trained to put into this. So one of the things we must remember is that our liturgy, or how we chant, how we do our rituals, is not stagnant. So at our home temple in Kyoto, there is a person that's the head of the liturgy department. And their job is not only to look at how we chant or what we do, but it's also to try to maybe make a few accommodations for maybe something that would be more relevant for a contemporary audience. And so depending when you get ordained, or how old you are taught a different way to chant certain chants. And so if you have your PDF open or your book, if you could look at the very end and you can see page 59, where we go Namo Amida Butsu, so that's straightforward across. And what I saw for the first time at the National Council meeting is they're chanting it in this modern interpretation, which is flat. So if you look at the page 59, I go Gani Shinu Doku. The way that they're encouraging us to chant it now is Gani Shidoku. See, I can barely do it. And so for those that have maybe ministers that have been in the ministry for quite a while, or if you have a Japanese minister, interestingly enough, for history buffs, that the way that I'm chanting it, they don't chant it that way in Japan anymore. That's a really old-fashioned way of chanting it. So Eric and I will talk about it, and maybe you can talk about it in the feedback when we have our discussion group, if you like to keep it the old-fashioned way, or do you want to do it the new standard way, or if there's a difference. So maybe that's something that we can talk about. So I just wanted to bring that up because, like I said, it was the first time at National Council meeting where I heard all of the ministers and the Sangha chanted in that flat tone. So today's talk is on one of the key teachings that we have that is universal in all schools of Buddhism. And we have covered this topic before. This is talking about the three treasures. Usually when we're talking about the introduction to Buddhist class, it's usually related to the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. But today what I'd like to do is share my experiences of how this teaching has been very helpful for me with people going through difficult times, and how the doctrine or the teachings can reach people, even as the same words, their interpretation for the situation they're in at that time can have a very different meaning. So I'd like to start off with just reading a simple version of the three treasures. Can you join me in Gasho, please? I take refuge in the Buddha. I take refuge in the Dharma. I take refuge in the Sangha. Namadats, 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 namadats. As I mentioned earlier, when I try to give a Dharma talk or on here, it's fun for me to do the Dharma Breeze because it's less structured than a traditional service that we do on a Sunday. So I can kind of play around with the format, which I hope that you enjoy. I hope I don't confuse folks. And so talking about this tonight, I'd like to talk about it through the prism of my experience of this very simple teaching and how people that I've worked with have interpreted it for their own use at that time. When I was thinking about doing a talk on the three treasures, I always think, because in my ministry, I've been touched by hundreds of people. Actually, I've been touched by thousands of people. But when you're in the ministry, you get to know people very intimately. You get to know families. And I'd like to share an experience because a family that went through a very severe tragedy with me following every step as their minister and seeing how for them, the three treasures worked for them to help them through that difficult time. When I started the ministry, like anybody else in any other job, I was very green and very self-conscious. And I started at Fresno in Central California. And Fresno has over 500 members, Ekoji. Can you imagine that? Over 500 members. The Dharma school at that time was fluctuating between 60 and 80 kids, Girl Scout troops, Boy Scout troops. So besides the Sunday service, I would be part of my job, which I thoroughly enjoyed. I would represent our temple with the shared Boy Scout troops for Eagle Awards, Cub Scout Awards, all these types of things. So it was a very busy temple in that way. And working with the Dharma school is always enjoyable. And so for the very first Dharma school, I was very apprehensive because I'm the new minister, and they had it at a bowling alley. Okay, this is the way to start Dharma school right, everybody. You need to start at a bowling alley because it does let out the tension, and especially the younger kids, man, they got pretty wild throwing those balls around. But so I pull up to the parking lot. I've been in Fresno maybe 2 months, and this is my first time meeting a lot of the kids. And I get out of the car, and there's this family with a station wagon and their young child who was probably about 13 at the time. And so I'm saying, can I, and I look in there like pulling out boxes, and he looked at me, the father looked at me and says, aren't you going to help me? Are you just going to stand there? Aren't you going to help me unload the car? And I instantly bonded with his very down-to-earth sense of humor, very sincere sense of humor. And his wife was joking, but more quiet, and the son was very quiet. So I went in and I hung out with them. And so they were the first family that I bonded with at Fresno. And they would come every Sunday. Dad was a farmer. He didn't care too much about church, but he thought it was good for the son to come to temple, right? And so I've been working with them, and then they started coming irregularly, which was a concern for me. I started wondering what was going on. And I got a horrifying call. I got a call that the father had passed. Now you have to realize the father was 64 years old, and I did not know that he was ill. So I go to the farmhouse, and as I've explained before, you have these makara gyos where you go to the family when someone's passed, and you do a service, and you try to provide comfort for the family. And it was very emotional because he was only 64. And so the wife, was saying, well, what should I do? Because her son, I didn't mention, had special needs. So he didn't communicate as easily as someone that his age would have been. So it was very hard on him to try to process what was going on. And so with him, I sat him in the corner and I said, well, you remember the three treasures, because this is what we had studied. And I said, he says, oh, I take faith. Faith, I take refuge in the Buddha. And in his mind, when he talks about the Buddha, which we'll talk about, is a little different than maybe we understand Shin Buddhism. When we talked about Buddha, he's thinking, I take refuge in Shakyamuni Buddha. I take refuge in the Dharma, the teachings, and the Sangha. And so for him, and because his communication style was a little unusual, was repeating this almost like a mantra. And so the side effect of that is that he associated me with his father passing. So in the traditional Jodo Shinshu tradition, we had the funeral, which was very sad, of course. And then we had the 49th day service. So he associated me with death. When I put on, he'd be fine with me if I wasn't wearing my black robes, but if I wore my black robes, he was very affected by it. And like I said, the reason that this story, and the reason why I'm telling it, is because how the different people dealt with using the Nembutsu. And so then 6 months later, I get a call and his mother passed. And so I go to the same farmhouse. There he is, and here he is at 13 or whatever age he was. And there's mom, and what do you say? And so for him, I said, and he says, and he started saying, he said the Nembutsu, and then he started saying the three treasures. And then in his mind, he says, mom is with Buddha. Mom is hearing the teachings. Mom is part of the Sangha now. And it was so interesting to see for him. I mean, he lost two parents within a year, and he's trying to utilize the Dharma and in a way that was very meaningful for him. So for that time, the comfort of saying the three treasures was beyond what we do in our normal Sunday service. I mean, we say it so many times, and I think a lot of times the words just kind of go through us and we don't think of the depth of it. But for me, witnessing that, and then when we had his mother's service, and I cried, how can you not cry? He was there in the front row, and he was reciting, he was saying the three treasures. And so then he moved with his uncle and aunt that lived in the town next to us, and he's in college now and he's doing well. So that's the good news. But I saw the power of the three treasures in a way that I never conceptualized it before, that it could be that meaningful to someone that maybe, has special needs, that maybe doesn't understand the three treasures in a way that we do. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to go through the version of the three treasures that I like for us that are older, maybe have more life experiences, not having a tragedy. Maybe I know some of us had recently, but having a tragedy right now where you're thinking about the three treasures. And again, I'm sorry if I refer back to the original purple Jodo Shinshu book. This actually, so some of you might be interested to know, this was the last service book published by our national organization in 1992. And so they have all these different readings in it. And I like the way that the readings are written. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to go through the three treasures in this and explain the nuances of what Sensei is saying. And it was interesting because when I was working on this talk, the version that I like is by Reverend Nakagaki of the New York Buddhist Temple, or Buddhist Church, excuse me. So my predecessor by almost 20 years wrote this. And so there was a really nice special connection to me that all these years Sensei's writing has touched me. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a few lines and then I'm going to explain the nuances. So the idea is that you have the leader that leads the refuge. And so usually it could be a person from the Sangha, it could be, you know, a chairperson. And so that starts off with a line that might be kind of interesting or kind of not so easy to comprehend. It says, "Rare is it to receive life in human form, yet now I have received it. Rare is it to hear the Buddha Dharma, now I've heard it." So when we talk in Shin concepts, we usually don't talk about reincarnation. We don't talk about past lives. But one of the pressing issues of Buddhism and when Shakyamuni Buddha, when we talk the teachings, is that we have the cycle of birth and death, and there's a way out of that. So this is where it gets different. So in some schools of Buddhism, it's meditation. Other schools of Buddhism, it's following precepts. In Jodo Shinshu Buddhism, it's having Shinjin, or the entrusting heart, and starting the path. But here in the Shin text, he's saying how wonderful it is that whether you believe it literally, as in that I've been here before, or for us that are over 25, how many different personalities or types of situations have we gone through? We're all different people than we were even 10 years ago. So now that we're sitting here on this Wednesday night in 2024, we're having the opportunity of hearing this. And maybe we didn't, maybe when we were in temple 20 years ago, maybe when we were kids, we weren't able to hear it. So this is an affirmation about how fortunate we are in this very moment right now to be able to reflect on and receive the Buddhist teachings. And then it goes on, "Unless I cross this elusive world in the present life, in what life could I possibly cross it? Let us assemble together and take refuge in the three treasures with deep sincerity." So again, whether you want to take this literally, that we've had many past lives and now it's the chance for us to go to the next step, or if you want to say in our personal lives, all of our thoughts, maybe tonight, this teaching will resound with us. And this is the time, this time is now for us, and that we will be able to move on with taking deep sincerity. I noticed that Ken, I always pick on poor Ken. I don't think he's here tonight. But the idea is that we do engage with the teaching. So the idea, is this a practice? We can talk about that in the discussion. But the idea is that there is intention. And so then we want to have the intention of hearing the three treasures with deep sincerity. So tonight we'll try this with mindfulness. So the first refuge we all know is that I take refuge in the Buddha. And it says, "My sincere wish that together with all beings," again, like this Bodhisattva practice I talked about last week, not about me, I'm not only worried about this, I'm wanting to have with all sentient beings, may I understand and experience the great path and rise to the highest Bodhi mind. So what he's saying, and I've mentioned this before, so one of the nuanced differences in our teachings at Jodo Shinshu is we're not referring to Shakyamuni Buddha necessarily in this, like the Theravadan tradition or other traditions would. We're talking about Shakyamuni. No, in Shin Buddhism, we're talking about enlightenment itself, Buddha nature or Amida Buddha, very interchangeable for how we personally relate to that. And so what we're doing is that I'm taking refuge in, so later on we take refuge in the Dharma, but the Sangha is like, if it's Amida Buddha, if it's that concept of Shinjin, if it's that concept of entrusting, that is what we're doing with the Buddha. And as I said with my example of the wonderful Dharma school student, he thought of Shakyamuni Buddha, and that was fine because that is what he needed to have at that moment to hear the teachings in a meaningful way. So then it says, "I take refuge in the Dharma. My sincere wish is that together with all beings," again, this wonderful Bodhisattva thing, not just me, everybody, "with all beings, I may deeply enter the storehouse of sutras and attain ocean-like wisdom." The reason that I like the wording is, even though Sensei is Japanese, he has a very deep understanding of the traditional wording. And so when we talk about the storehouses of the sutras, so that's talking about all of the teachings, all the potentialities. And so they talk about the concentration of all the Dharma teachings. It's a storehouse. And so I'm sure Sensei, well, I don't know, Sensei's from Japan. And so traditionally in Japan, you had a storehouse where you had all of your possessions to keep it away from the humidity and the snow in the winter. And so they would like to use the metaphor of storehouse of the teachings. So for example, our head temple in Japan is called Honganji. Honganji is the temple of the vow, meaning the 18th vow. And I would like to think that for us, that is the storehouse of the teachings for us as Jodo Shinshu followers. I am very sad to see Reverend Matsumoto, who is the greatest influence on my ministry besides Reverend Castro, is retiring from the Institute of Buddhist Studies. He's human. We all need to retire. But he impressed me so much throughout his career as a minister. And he went to Tokyo, Kyoto to Honzan, the head temple, and he brought back an udashiki, and many of you are familiar. That's the cloth that Japanese usually traditionally would wrap things in. And it was this dragon, this very dramatic dragon with all of this. And I said, what in the world is this? He goes, this dragon is protecting the sutras at Honzan, our head temple. This is the protector of the vow. So again, this idea, this nuance of the idea of that the Honganji and Ekoji, or however you want to think about that storehouse of the sutras, is there for us and for us to share. And then, of course, the third treasure is I take refuge in the Sangha. My sincere wish is that together with all sentient beings, that I may accordingly be united in the great assembly and become freed from all delusions. Now, this is kind of an interesting wording. I'll give you an example because in this book, this is the three treasures 2, but in the original one, version 1, it says, become a unit of true accord in a life of harmony and a spirit of universal oneness, freed from the bondage of selfishness. So again, it's this idea that when we talk about in Buddhism, part of what the Buddhist teachings is trying for us to realize that the interconnectedness that we have with everybody else, that we don't survive in the world, either in the physical, secular world with receiving food, receiving shelter, and especially not when it comes to the Dharma, that the Dharma is something that is interconnected with the Sangha. And so the teachings are very, very important here. And so this idea is that we're talking about, again, the Bodhisattva idea, it's not myself, it's becoming in a true accord with others. And so, we don't talk about that when we have our traditional Sunday services and tonight, but the idea is that we are sharing the Dharma and we are part of that Sangha and is a part of not just ourselves, but breaking out into a larger group, a larger concept of sharing the Dharma and being free from all delusions. Then the leader comes in at the very end and says, the highest, most profound and wondrous Dharma is rare to encounter through millions of kalpas. That's pretty dramatic, isn't it? I'm sure some of you have come across the word kalpa, and I love it because I have people that will say, well, what is a kalpa exactly? They want to know the scientific analysis of what a kalpa is. And one of them that I heard, and of course, this is old Indian logic, is that if I took my fuho, my sleeve of my fuho, and I was on the top of a mountain, and the wind blew every 100 years just once, and it'd wipe across the top of the mountain, a kalpa would be the time it would take for my robe to wear down the mountain. In other words, inconceivable. And so it's a very Buddhistic way of saying it's inconceivable that it goes beyond human conception. And so what we're here is that this is so for us to hear the teachings, we don't hear it for this inconceivable amount of time. And like I said, it could be us in our everyday life, not opening ourselves to being able to hear the teachings. And then it says, I am now able to I'm able to see and hear it, to receive and keep it. So again, we were talking about deep listening or deep hearing, just a couple of weeks ago. And here's the same way. It says, how wonderful this is. This whole three treasures is, fronted and ended by how wonderful it is that we're able to hear that. And now I'm able to see, hear, and receive it. And it says, my sincere wish is that may I understand the real essence of the Tathagata. And Tathagata means the Buddha or the teachings. So I hope that I believe that it's still standard in virtually every BCA temple and Dharma school services that we read the three treasures, at the beginning of the service as part of the reading. And I hope tonight this opens up the eye for you for how the teaching is the three treasures, even though it's very simple in concept, how it has many dimensions. And as I've mentioned before, the three treasures is such a powerful teaching that is universal with all schools of Buddhism. And so then when Eric and I, we didn't do it at the same time, but when we received ordination, what does the Gomonchu does? He bestows upon you, in Japanese, of course, the three treasures. And so that's how powerful that is. When we receive the Buddhist name and the affirmation, the bishop symbolically gives you the three treasures. So thank you for listening, and I hope that when you hear the three treasures in the next service, it will have a much more or a more resounding multi-level feeling for you. Can you please join me in Gasho? Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Okay, so if you could join me with the group reading, and this is not in the red book, this is in the PDF, and it's called Our Pledge. And I told you the reason I enjoy it because it's very much Bodhisattva that we are sharing it. So please join me in Gasho and read with me. Breaking out of my shell, I shall share a warm smile and speak gentle words, just like the kind Buddha. Not becoming lost in my greed, anger, and ignorance, I shall think and act with an open mind, just like the calm and peaceful Buddha. Not putting myself first, I will share the joy and sadness of others, just like the compassionate Buddha. Realizing the gift of life I have received, I shall strive to live each day to its fullest, like the Buddha who tirelessly works to liberate all. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Okay, so if we can, before the discussion group, if we can conclude with a very short sitting silent meditation. So please sit in your chair, relax your shoulders, feet firmly on the floor. Please join me in Gasho. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namadats. Namadats.